Hello, and welcome back to Human Evolution. Today we want to discuss one of the major lines of evidence for evolution, and that is going to be anatomical evidence. So we've been talking about how you go from non-living molecules to living cells, and then from living cells, just these very basic cells with the minimum requirements, cytoplasm, ribosomes, nuclear material, nucleic acid, that sort of thing, DNA, RNA. And then you go to these more complex cells, the eukaryotic cells with all of the organelles and these complex functions, and then getting them to organize, to cooperate into these multicellular bodies. Well, it turns out that that has happened over time, and we've talked about some very specific occurrences that have made that possible. Well, you can also use the development and evolution of these structures that we see to show the path that evolution has taken over time. And so we can look at structures and we can decide whether these structures make animals related to each other or not. And so we're looking at being related through the form and function of traits. And so when we talk about traits, we are talking about characters or phenotypes. So traits are just the manifestation of whatever the genetic code is telling you to have. So a trait could be behavioral, it could be physical, anything that the animal has as a structure or is doing. Okay, and so we're going to be talking about physical structures. You can also call them characters or phenotypes, like I said. But the first thing that we want to do is we want to distinguish between ancestral traits and derived traits. Now, this is a tricky thing because it is relative to what you are talking about. So here is an example. Let's take hair, right? If you're looking at mammals, hair is a derived character. Okay, that means that hair is in all mammals but no other groups. Okay, but if you take those same mammals and you want to talk about having a lung, right, or lungs, that is not a derived trait for mammals, because yes, mammals have lungs, but so do amphibians, so do reptiles, and so do birds, right? So did dinosaurs. So that is an ancestral feature because it evolves before mammals do. Okay, and another example, taking that hair example one step further, for humans, hair is an ancestral trait. We have hair, but all the other mammals have hair too, and we're fairly new, and all these other mammals had it well before we did. So it's an ancestral trait for us. But when you start looking at apes, the loss of hair is a derived trait for humans. Okay? If you have any questions on this, please make sure that you ask me in class, because we want to make sure that we're keeping this straight. And again, it's tricky because it's relative to what you're talking about. Okay, so what is the evidence for evolution here when we're talking about structures? There are four actually big things, right? There are homologous structures, and those are structures that are similar due to common ancestry. We have analogous structures, and those are structures that evolve to be similar because of similar pressures on those organisms, but they do not arise from a common ancestor. They develop from independent structures. You can see evidence of evolution in embryonic development, because the more closely related the species, they will actually have similar embryonic development. And the other thing that's exciting about that is you can see evidence of earlier features in the early embryonic development phases, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then the last thing on this one are vestigial structures. These are things that have no apparent function in a species, yet they're homologous to a function in another species. And again, I'm going to give you examples of those later on. But let's start with homology first, because I think that this is probably the most obvious thing. So here you have this structure that is different in lots of different animals, but we have a common ancestry. And I've chosen, because it's one of the textbook examples, it's the classic example, is the limb of a vertebrate. So here you have a dinosaur, pterodactyl, right? And you can see these bones are highlighted that match, right? And so in the flying animals, you can see that they have very similar structures. Here you've got the little well, if you look at, I'm going to start with the back because it's a little bit more like our hand. So here you have the fingers, basically, right? So you have the Phalanges, wow. And so you have these guys, and you can see in the bird they've lost some, but they're in a similar place, and then you have the rest of the fingers, right, which in the birds are not fingers. Here, okay, you've got the radius and the ulna idea, same in the bat, and then here you have the humerus. And here's the human arm, by the way, so you can see that. And so, I'm sorry, these are the metacarpals. My bad. Metacarpals. So here you've got the metacarpals here, and then in the pterodactyl, so that you can see the dinosaur. And it's a fun thing about the dinosaur is actually the wing is the pinky finger. But here in the dolphin, you can see that looks a whole lot like a little hand. Same thing with the seal. Now, in the sheep and the dog, they're made for running. The dog still has like the digits. The sheep they've fused into two, and a horse is fused into one. And then the shrew has the digging, right, the grasping, the holding kind of thing. And so you can see that these are all arising from the same structures. These are homologous structures. Okay, there is this lack of similarity, right? Because you have divergent evolution. So even though you have these common structures, they are in fact all different in some way, and they're used for different things. And that is because different pressures have been placed on each of these organisms, and so they have changed over time, adapting to those pressures. And we'll talk about that when we talk about natural selection. But this is homologous characteristics are an example of divergent evolution. Okay, and here's just a nice little. You've got your swimmer, and you've got your quadruped, and you've got your biped, and you have your flyer. And so Darwin called this descent with modification. So you pass on these traits, and we'll talk about this again in our conversation about natural selection later on. Homology is based on the idea that organisms that have similar features are probably related by descent. That means they have a common ancestor. So when you look at cats, they all have retractable claws. They've got some other characteristics. They have tapetum lucidum, which are a reflective lining in the back of their eye. They have all of these traits that make them cats. Well, it turns out that they're all very closely related. They're all in the same family, Felidae. So you can kind of say it as like, well, you know, if you see a cat, it's probably a cat. Okay, so organisms with similar features tend to be related by descent, okay, and that can be as narrow as just cat, okay, or it can be all of these vertebrates. Now, these four pictures are all of mammals. You can see hair, 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 hair. This guy, not a mammal, feathers, but you can see that we're related. Look, 2 eyes, a nose structure, a mouth structure, 2 upper limbs, 2 lower limbs. Everybody on here's got these. Okay, so you can see that they're related, but you've got some that are more closely related than others because they're sharing more common traits. Okay, so when we start looking at this idea of common ancestry, you can sum it up by saying that as a general rule, the more homologous characters that are shared by 2 species, the more closely related they are. Okay, so these guys share a lot more traits than with, like, the lion shares a lot more traits with the tiger than it does with the foxes, but the foxes share more traits with each other than they share with the cats. Okay, and so even though all 4 of these animals are related, these are more closely related, and these are more closely related to each other. Okay, now we are going to talk about later on that it's maybe these structures are not always the best to tell whether something is related or not. The best thing that you can do is look at DNA sequences, RNA sequences, and proteins. But the trait thing is a general rule kind of deal, because remember, traits arise from genes. Yeah. Okay, now the other thing we have are analogies. Analogous characters don't share a common ancestor, so they don't come from the same thing, but they still show that evolution is occurring because you have these structures that were different in other animals that have been shaped over time to look the same because they're fulfilling the same function. And the panda's thumb is a really good example. Here's our thumb. It's one of our 5 digits. Mammals are known for having, actually vertebrates in general are known, well, that's not true. Amphibians, reptiles, and mammals are all known for their 5 digits, and sometimes those are modified, sometimes not. But we've got these 5 digits, okay? So a thumb is one of our 5. Well, if you look at the panda, you can see that the panda has a little thumb that's helping it hold its bamboo. But if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there is a claw attached to each of its digits. So that means that if the panda has a real thumb, it's got 6 digits. Well, it doesn't. It has 5 digits, just like everybody else. Except this, the quote, thumb, end quote, is actually an extension of the wrist bone. So if you were to bend your hand back right now, right, and you were to look where your thumb is, you would find a little kind of protrusion, but for us it's fairly smooth. For the panda, that little protrusion, that bone right underneath at the wrist, where the thumb and the wrist meet, extends all the way out and is used to grasp things by the panda. These are not coming from the same place. So this is convergent evolution because they have the same function, but they don't have the same origin. Okay, so convergent evolution, the definition of that is that you have two different species from different lineages that show similar characteristics because they have similar environmental pressures. Okay, and I've got three examples here: the anteater and the echidna. Aerial rootlets, these are the roots that allow ivies and climbing vines to anchor into buildings and trees and stuff. And then antifreeze proteins in fish. So our first picture, here is the anteater and here is the echidna. You can see these guys are not that closely related. I mean, they're both mammals, but they're not really that closely related. But you can see they have these long faces, long snouts, right? And that's because they both eat ants, and ants live in little, ant piles, and so they have to get in there. And then here you have, over here, ivy, which we've probably all seen, and the winter creeper. And you can see these little rootlets, okay, they're called aerial rootlets, and they anchor into the trees. They both look very similar. It turns out, though, that each of these has developed over time from different structures. One of them, it may be from stems. One of them may be modified leaves. One of them may be modified roots, because there are actually lots and lots of climbing vines. And so you have these different origin points for these guys, okay? And then the last one, here you have the sea raven and a longhorn sculpin. And these guys live in very, very cold waters. They both have these proteins in their blood that keeps the blood from freezing. They're called antifreeze proteins. There are lots and lots and lots of these. These are just two examples, but these antifreeze proteins have evolved in many, many, many different lineages independently. They're very helpful, and cold water is a huge pressure. Interestingly enough, though, you can see that they have other similarities, right? Like the way their fins are, the eyes being on top of the head, the wide mouth, long flat body. That's because they occupy very similar niches. They both live on the ground. They both live in very cold waters, in deep waters. And so those factors really shape these animals. But again, they don't have a common ancestor that has those traits. Okay, now, just as a side note, everything has a common ancestor if you go back far enough, okay? And so what we're talking about when we talk about the evolution of traits, when we say common ancestry, it means that there is an organism that has the beginnings of that structure from the same group of cells, okay? And so that's what we're talking about. And we'll talk about it more later on too. And if you want more examples, please ask me in class. But here is, because I'm happy to talk about it more, here is an example of homologous traits. Remember, those were the two wings. Now, they have the same function. So, not only are they homologous, but they also do the same thing. These are analogous traits because they have the same function, but they don't arise from a common ancestor, okay? And obviously the butterfly is not related to the hawk in the same way that the bat is. Okay, now the other thing we want to talk about is embryology. You can, when you look at these little guys, this is a fish, this is a chicken, and this is a human, and you can see they are very, very similar in many ways. All three of them have the little tail, they have the little, head bud area, they have the pharyngeal pouches, right? All of these things that you can see, the spinal column is forming little somites there. And so you can see that they share a lot of features in this very first trimester, right? Because when you divide up a pregnancy, right, you have the first trimester, the second trimester, and the third trimester. But in the first trimester, you can see big similarities, right? And so these pharyngeal slits are very much like gill slits, right? But they get absorbed, actually they don't get absorbed, they develop into other things. But here's little tails, those get reabsorbed in many animals, or they're shorter, or they flatten out, right, in fish. And so you have this homology through development. And so species that differ as adults can often be very, very similar during embryonic stages, okay? And so the presence of these gill ridges in humans indicate that we evolved from aquatic animals with gill slits, and that's true because all of the land animals evolved from fish, right? Humans have long, bony tails. We evolved from mammals that had tails, right? And so there are these similarities. By the way, it's a man named Ernst Haeckel that figured this out, and we've taken it to all sorts of new levels since then. Okay, now vestigial traits are the last thing. These are traits that you find on organisms that, you know, are not helpful. Okay, so I've got a little picture of an embryo here. There's a little cutie. Here's where the backbone is going to be. Here's the pectoral limb bud. Here's the pelvic limb bud. There's a little tail going off to a point. Here's the little eye. The little mouth is forming. There's a little brain area. My question to you is, what is this? It's a dolphin. It's a dolphin. So over time, through the development, of course, you know, it's going to look more dolphin-like. These are going to turn into the front flippers, right? These are going to be reabsorbed. This is going to flatten out, okay? But right now, that would be hard to tell, right? So what we're really talking about is the loss of structures, right? And modifications to animals over time often include the loss of structures. And vestigial organs are remnants of these past structures that are no longer in use by the animal. Okay, so here's your first question. When a structure is present during development and is lost, the cells dedifferentiate and redifferentiate into the cells required for new structures. The cells in lost structures undergo apoptosis. They're consumed by macrophages produced by the organism's immune system. Oh, that should be an apostrophe there. Or they are released and float away. Right? Because here's the idea. Let's say that you have a limb, right? And you saw in the embryo that you had a limb bud, right? And so when we're talking about these being lost, the question is, how does it work? Well, first of all, we know from our stem cell conversation that you cannot have these differentiated cells, for the most part, dedifferentiate and redifferentiate. Now, that does happen in some organisms, like amphibians, for instance, who regrow limbs. That definitely happens. So it does happen on occasion. But this is not, during development, what is going to happen. Yeah. They are also not consumed by macrophages, right? Macrophages are those cells that go and they basically eat foreign invaders, okay? And so they're the kind of like the cleanup crew of your body. Well, when you're developing, you don't have the immune system all set up, so there aren't any macrophages available, right? They're just released from their epithelial tethers and float away. That is pretty wasteful, actually, and that is not what happens. What happens is the cells in these lost structures undergo programmed cell death, apoptosis. So the answer is B, yeah? And so they basically self-destruct, and then those materials can be used to build new tissues. So that's pretty exciting. Okay, so moving on, whales, right? Whales are really interesting because they evolved from terrestrial herbivores, right? And the evidence of this is little vestigial pelvis. This is what used to be the pelvis and the pelvic limbs, yeah? And you can see that it is in both toothed whales, right here, and in baleen whales. This is a baleen whale as well. Okay, flies, for those of you that have taken genetics or are going to take genetics, the fruit fly, some of them have vestigial wings, right? And so these are little wings. They don't fly anymore, but there they have them nonetheless. And speaking of wings, you have the kiwi, who has no wings at all. They've just completely gone away. And then you have the ostrich, who has wings, but they're for display as opposed to flight, because ostriches run really well. They do not fly at all. Continuing on with birds, you've got the hollow skeleton of the birds. All birds have this great hollow skeleton that makes them lighter and is what allows them to fly. These guys have it too, and you can see those wings are going nowhere. They are not flying anywhere, but they're great for swimming, and penguins swim really, really well. Now, right, This is a crawfish. It's a blind cave crawfish, but you can see it still has little eye stalks, right? So there should be eyes there, but there aren't because they live totally in the dark. And so the eye structure has actually evolved to go away. Yeah. And then of course here is our little tail right there. And we already talked about that, but there it is. That's a vestigial structure too. Okay. The appendix, right here we have this appendix in a large herbivores, right? This thing is huge, okay? And you can see you've got this tail end, here's the appendix, right? But here's the appendix, yeah? And so it's much bigger, and when you start talking about horses and things like that, it's huge, right? And the cecum actually is a whole lot larger in these animals too, but the appendix, and we don't really know a whole lot about the appendix being helpful. There is some speculation that it plays a part in the immune system, but mostly it seems to just be vestigial, and you can actually have it taken out without, oh, I'm sorry, this, by the way, there's the appendix, there's the appendix in other animals. You can get it taken out, and it's not a big deal. Okay, and here, the wisdom teeth. And we'll talk about wisdom teeth a whole lot more later on, because this is one of the hallmarks of having our nice human face, right? Having that small face means we don't have room for the extra teeth that our relatives have. And so there are people who don't even have them anymore, yeah? But they give us a lot of trouble when they come in, and we'll come back to that later on. One of my favorites, the goosebump, right? If you looked like this, goosebumps would be very helpful because they would raise your hair, and you could become fluffier, which means you're scarier, and you can trap air in between the hairs so you can stay warmer, right? And you can think about furry animals. They fluff up when they're scared, and they fluff up when they're cold. We fluff up not at all because we don't have a whole lot of hair. We have tiny, useless little hairs that do nothing for us. Okay, and then there's a little divot at the pinna of the ear. And this is a remnant here, right? There is a muscle that attaches. So first of all, you've got this little addition, like this little pointy part. But also, there's a muscle that attaches to the ear that allows these guys, and many animals, but to move the ears. We don't move the ears, we actually move our head. And so we don't have that anymore. And what about these? The male nipple. Totally useless, right? Nipples are for babies to feed on. Men do not do that, but I will tell you right now, not vestigial. These, it just so happens that nipples develop before sexual differentiation, and so all babies have nipples. It's just that females develop them into something useful, whereas men just have them. Not vestigial. Okay, here's your next question. Structures that have been lost can re-evolve independently. The answer to that is false, actually, because traits really don't. Once you've lost something, you can, like, let's say that you have 6 legs. Oh, I know. Wait, let's say that you're a kiwi and you've lost your wings. You will not evolve new limbs from the same structures that the limbs in your common ancestor have, right? Now, new wings may arise, but they'll be from different structures, okay? And so typically, once you've lost it, you've lost it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about atavistic traits. Sometimes you get traits that are supposed to be vestigial, or they're supposed to be absent once you develop, and then they don't. Here's a really good example. The human tail. See, this little baby has a tail. Interestingly enough, this child is viewed as a living representation of the monkey god Hanuman, which is kind of interesting, but it's because it has this little monkey tail. Now, there's no musculature associated with this. As far as I know, it's not like it's, can grab coffee cups or anything. But anyway, that is an atavistic trait because it did not get reabsorbed. It did not go away during development. Here are little legs on a snake, right? These should not be there, but sometimes it happens. And here, legs on a dolphin. What? That's crazy. So sometimes you have these traits because there's a mistake and they don't get reabsorbed. But most of the time, you'll end up with a vestigial trait instead of an atavistic trait. Atavistic traits are mistakes. Okay, so here's your last question. Given our common ancestry with the other apes, what would be a good example of a possible atavistic trait that would show our close relationship? Large canines, hooves, claws, or night vision? All of these things are ancestral traits to some ancestor that we have, okay? However, the only one that our common ancestor with the other apes would have would be large canines. Hooves, nope, we don't have any sort of common ancestor that has hooves, so we would not get those, right? Claws, we do have common ancestors that have claws, but apes also have fingernails, so they are ancestral traits to both us and apes. Night vision, other apes have those, older apes have night vision. We do not have really good night vision, but the other apes really don't either because they're also diurnal, which means they live during the day. So large canines, because I don't know if you've ever seen inside of a chimp's mouth, and then the other, like way back common ancestors that we split off, that chimps and us split from, also large canines. And actually all of the other apes have large canines. We do not, and we'll talk about why later on. Anyway, so that's it for this. Please let me know if you have any questions at the beginning of class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.